Installing and configuring Microsoft SQL Server 2008, Part 1 of 2. In this nugget, we're going to look at what is perhaps the most important step in deploying SQL Server, namely planning and installation. Like almost any enterprise server product, unless you get it right on the front end, you're probably going to wind up in a world of hurt once you've rolled out the software and you're actually using it in production. Therefore, in this part 1 of 2, we're going to look at planning and installing this product. In so doing, we're going to step through in slow motion fashion considerations such as what are the services that underlie SQL Server 2008 and how do they work, both from a planning and implementation standpoint. We'll also answer a lot of questions that confuse new and even sometimes experienced DBAs, such as what are instances, what are service accounts, what's the difference between the database engine and, say, the analysis services engine. So fasten your seatbelts and get prepared to do some heavy-duty learning. SQL Server 2008 Edition Comparison. One thing that you'll be expected to know for your 7432 certification exam, and certainly an important, critically important planning decision in your lives as DBAs, is understanding the implications among the various editions. Now, there's a cost differential that factors in choosing an edition, and related to these, of course, in your lives as DBAs, although you won't be expected to know this for your exam, is the issue of licensing. Licensing is not covered on the exam objective, so we're not going to worry about this, but I definitely want to give you that heads up. I know lots of DBAs, fortunately I haven't been bitten by that particular bug, who have purchased the wrong edition for the needs of their business and then had to go back and explain to their boss, we should have purchased Enterprise instead of Workgroup. Can I have a few extra $1,000? That's never a comfortable conversation. At any rate, what you're seeing on this whiteboard, friends, is a plethora, if you don't mind the $5 word, of SQL Server 2008 editions. This has been part of Microsoft's strategy for a long time, as I know you know, not just with SQL Server, but with Windows and a lot of their products. They give us this whole cornucopia of different product SKUs, or stock keeping units, aimed at satisfying small, medium, large, extra small, extra large, and all different size businesses in between. Now then, at the top end of the spectrum, we have SQL Server 08 Enterprise Edition, and this has every feature known to humankind included. Now you'll notice that I've bundled together Enterprise Edition, Developer Edition, and Evaluation Edition. Here's the deal. This confuses a lot of people. I want you to be clear on this. These are all identical. In other words, SQL Server 08 Enterprise, Developer, and Evaluation Edition all have every feature thrown in. The difference is how they're used. Enterprise obviously is the most expensive because it's intended for use in production environments. Developer can be run, as you see down at the bottom of the slide, on a client operating system as well as a server OS. Enterprise can only be run on Windows Server 2003 and Windows Server 2008 operating systems. Evaluation Edition is the free version that you can order from Microsoft or you can download from their website and is intended for, you guessed it, demonstration purposes. Now, what's the deal with Developer Edition? Developer Edition is really cheap. You can buy it for under $100. The deal with it is a fully functional version of SQL 08. It doesn't time out, it doesn't expire, but legally you're not allowed to use Developer Edition for a production server environment. If you try to do that and Microsoft catches you, you're going to be in a world of hurt. And you see over on the right, I've given you some of those features that you get in the top-end SQL Server. Up to 16 node clustering, database mirroring, online operations, business intelligence. Some of this stuff probably looks like Greek to you. We'll cover most or all of those topics in future nuggets in this series, so don't worry about some of those terms right now. All right, so that's the top end, and we'll be working with SQL Enterprise Edition for this series. At the bottom end of the full SKU SQL Server 08 suite, we have Standard Edition. This is, I guess you'd call the entry level of the full version product suite. This is just your general business use of SQL Server. You don't get any of the top end high availability or business intelligence features, but you do surprisingly get the ability to do two-node clustering, which is a nod toward high availability services. Workgroup is kind of standard, kicked up a little bit to bring a little Emerald Lagasse to you. Express Edition and Express with Advanced Services are your free, redistributable versions of SQL Server. Let's say we go into business as a software development company, and we want to build a line of business application that relies upon a back-end database, and we don't want to build a back-end database ourselves. We can actually write our line of business application to write to a SQL Server Express database, and Microsoft will allow us to actually bundle SQL Express with our line of business app. Isn't that neat? What's the Achilles heel? Well, SQL Express only supports one CPU, up to 1 gig of RAM, and the database can only grow to 4 gigs. So there's some significant limitations to SQL Express. Finally, there's SQL Server Compact Edition, which is also free, and it's intended for handheld PCs, Windows mobile devices, and really small footprint portable environments. And as I say at the bottom of this screen, that the developer and the Express Edition will both run on client operating systems. Everything else will run on server OSs only. Of course, if you're in a virtualized environment using VMware or Microsoft Hyper-V or Virtual PC or Virtual Server, you could always set up a virtual machine on any OS to run SQL Server that way. Now, missing from this slide, of course, and this is bringing in cutting-edge information that's not on the exam, I'm just throwing in, there is a final version of SQL Server 08 called SQL Server Data Services, and this is a nod toward something that's very hot nowadays called cloud computing. And this is a beta service that Microsoft is feeling very hot and bothered about. And this is a cloud-based version of SQL Server that you'll see more and more of as time goes on. And that's all I'll say about that now for lack of time. Now, after we select the appropriate edition and licensing mode, the next thing, of course, is we want to make sure that our hardware supports the edition that we need for SQL Server 2008. And I've always gone to the source for that information. A Google search for SQL Server 2008 system requirements will take you either to Microsoft.com or, as I've gone to here, I've gone to Microsoft's development area, the MSDN, the Microsoft Developer Network, SQL Server Developer Center. They have a page called Hardware and Software Requirements for Installing SQL Server 2008. We'll just buzz through here really quickly. It tells us that we have to have, if we don't have it installed, SQL Server Setup will install the .NET Framework 3.5 Service Pack 1, SQL Server Setup files, Windows Installer 4.5, and so on. And it just goes through, those are software requirements. And then it goes through and tells us we need an optical drive as appropriate, hard disk requirements, display, blah, blah, blah. You know the song and dance. I'm just going through your standard best practices as far as that goes. In 2009, the issue of hardware requirements for server software, it's almost become a non-issue. Isn't that amazing? I mean, just as recently as 5 or 6 years ago, we really had to be careful of stuff like disk cost, memory, or CPU. But today, with hard disk space being so inexpensive, with processors being dual core and quad core, with RAM now going well beyond the 4 gigabyte boundary, we don't have to worry about that kind of stuff anywhere near to the degree that we used to. Now then, after we've established that, what we're going to do now over the next few whiteboards is kind of step through some of the major questions that were asked during the SQL Server 2008 installation process. And what you're going to find, friends, is that if you've had experience installing SQL 2005, you're going to see some elegance at work here. In other words, you're going to see that the folks on the SQL Server 2008 product team really gave some thought to some of the limitations and weaknesses of the SQL 05 installation routine and saw how they could improve the process and did so. I think you're going to be impressed. I certainly was as I learned more about it. Some key questions of installation. One, and this is critical, service accounts and collations. And this is something that the new DBA thinks, all right, what's going on here? What is a service account? Any Windows Systems Administrator needs to know this information, and of course this factors into your certification exam. A service account is nothing more than a local Windows account, or more standard, a domain user account that is not going to be used for physical logon. It's going to be used by an application or service only. And the reason for that is simple. Because when we assign a Windows or a domain account to a service or application, that service or application is given roles, is given user rights, is given permissions that tend to go well beyond what a human being would ever need. Okay? Now, SQL Server will use one or more service accounts for a lot of different stuff. Check out this list. The database engine needs a service account, SQL Server Agent, full text search, SQL Server integration services, reporting services, analysis services. Now, if you're a security person, if you're really into security and you want to use the principle of least privilege and least service, you'll want to create a separate domain service account for each one of these components. More traditionally, what most administrators do, they'll create one domain user account and assign it to all of these. Now, that's really not high security, but it's better than what a lot of DBAs do, and they'll assign either the local system account, which is not a good idea, or, worse yet, horribly, they'll use the domain administrator account as your service account. Please don't ever do that. If you use the local system account, that's giving the operating system full access to all of these services. Or if you use the domain administrator account, that's giving domain admin, giving SQL Server domain admin credentials. And if a hacker or bad guy were to compromise SQL Server, you can just see what would happen. Not good. Now, collation is simply how SQL Server handles character data for storage, retrieval, and sorting. So think of it this way. Character data. So you've got a table with employee last name. So you've got a column that uses character data type. How are you going to handle sorting of that last name? How do you want A's handled? Like capital A, lowercase a, and let's say you've got accented characters with a grave accent. Would you want all three of these handled the same way? Or would you want uppercase A handled or sorted before lowercase a? Traditionally, we wouldn't care, would we? So the default collation used in SQL 08, at least the US English version, is what's called Latin 1 General. Now, the only time we would want to change the default collation is if you're working with non-US or Far Eastern character sets or languages. Let's say Russian, Cyrillic, or Chinese, simplified Chinese, completely different languages where you could see sort orders really getting wacky. You see what I mean? Now, when you set your default during installation, that's not carving anything in stone. You can always make changes to your collation at the database level, at the table level, or at the column level. We'll talk more about that later. Authentication